The setup. The cold night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, the dim glow of streetlights barely illuminating the quiet streets. Angela Thompson adjusted the hood of her sweatshirt, keeping her face hidden as she walked briskly toward her car. She had done this before, many times, but tonight, something felt different. Something felt off. Angela wasn't just another teenager. At 19, she was already one of the youngest federal prosecutors working undercover to expose police corruption. It wasn't a role she had ever envisioned for herself, but after witnessing too many injustices firsthand, she knew she had no choice but to take action. It was more than a job. It was a mission. Her latest investigation had led her to a particularly corrupt precinct, one that had a disturbing reputation for targeting black teens, planting evidence, and ensuring that anyone who questioned them disappeared into the system. Angela had spent months collecting evidence, wearing hidden cameras, recording conversations, and connecting the dots. She was close, so close, to exposing everything. But now, standing in the empty parking lot outside a small cafe, her instincts were screaming at her. She wasn't alone. Angela felt the hair on the back of her neck rise as she casually glanced around. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Her gut told her that someone was watching, waiting. She didn't hesitate. Slipping her hand into her pocket, she pressed a button on the tiny recording device sewn into her jacket's lining. It was always running, but she had programmed it to highlight key moments when she felt in danger. She reached her car, keys in hand, and was just about to open the door when, "Hey you," a sharp voice cut through the silence. Angela froze, her pulse quickening. She turned her head slightly, spotting two uniformed officers approaching her from across the lot. Officer Daniels and Officer Harris. The same two men she had been investigating for months. The same two men she knew were responsible for ruining countless lives. She knew immediately this was a setup. Angela forced herself to remain calm. She had planned for something like this, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Officer Daniels smirked, his pale blue eyes glinting under the streetlights. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the area. Someone matching your description." Angela arched an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity? Like what?" Officer Harris, the taller of the two, stepped forward, his presence looming. "Why don't we check your car? Just to be sure you're not carrying anything illegal." Angela clenched her jaw. There it was. The setup. This was how they worked. Stop someone for nothing, fabricate probable cause, and plant whatever they needed to justify an arrest. She had seen it play out too many times. And tonight, she was the target. "Unless you have a warrant," she said coolly, "I don't think I'm required to let you search my car." Officer Daniels chuckled. "You know the law, huh? That's cute." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "But let me explain how this works. When we say we need to check something, we're not really asking." Angela knew she had only seconds to decide her next move. She couldn't allow them to plant anything in her car, but resisting could escalate things, especially considering who they were. Before she could speak, Harris reached for his radio. "We have a possible suspect, female, black, resisting a lawful search." Angela's stomach clenched. Resisting. The one word that could turn a routine stop into something far worse. She had to act fast. "I'm not resisting," she said, raising her hand slightly. "But if you're going to accuse me of something, I'd like my lawyer present." That seemed to amuse them. Daniel shook his head. "You're not in a courtroom, sweetheart." No, but she would be soon. And she would be the one in control. Just then, a third figure emerged from the shadows, a plainclothes officer Angela recognized as Detective Nolan. Unlike Daniels and Harris, he wasn't someone she had investigated directly, but his presence here confirmed her fears. He wasn't here by accident. "This her?" Nolan asked, barely looking at Angela. Daniels nodded. "Yep. Got her right where we want her." Angela's heartbeat quickened. Right where they wanted her. That could only mean. Before she could react, Harris grabbed her wrist, yanking her toward him. "You're under arrest." "For what?" she demanded. Daniel smirked. "Possession of stolen goods." Angela's blood ran cold. That wasn't possible. She had nothing in her car, nothing they could use against her. Unless. Daniels opened the car door, reaching under the passenger seat. A moment later, he pulled out a small bag, one Angela had never seen before. He dangled it in front of her, as if taunting her. "Well, would you look at that?" Daniels said mockingly. "What do we have here?" "Looks like stolen credit cards, maybe some drugs." "That's not good." Angela's mind raced. They had planned this. They had planted it. And now, they were going to use it to frame her. "I've never seen that before," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "That's not mine." Harris sighed dramatically. "That's what they all say." Angela's hands balled into fists. They thought she was just another statistic, another black girl with no power, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. "Get her in the car," Nolan ordered. Daniels tightened his grip on her arm, but before they could force her into the squad car, Angela spoke again. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice unwavering. "You have no idea who I am." Harris rolled his eyes. "Sure, kid. And I'm the mayor." Angela took a deep breath, locking eyes with Nolan. "My name is Angela Thompson," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm a federal prosecutor." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's smirk faltered. Harris' grip on her arm loosened just slightly. Even Nolan, who had seemed so sure of himself, now looked uncertain. Angela used their hesitation to her advantage. "You've been under investigation for months," she continued, her voice unwavering. "Every word you've said tonight has been recorded. Every action you've taken has been documented. You didn't just target any teenager, you targeted the wrong one." Daniel's face turned pale. That's not possible." Angela pulled her wrist free. "Oh, but it is. And now you have two options. You let me go, or you find yourselves on trial next." Nolan took a slow step forward, his face unreadable. "You expect us to believe that?" Angela smiled coldly. "I don't need you to believe me. I just need you to look at the evidence." From her pocket, she pulled out a small USB drive, the one containing every recording, every file, every corrupt act she had collected. She tossed it to Nolan. "Take a look," she said, "and then tell me if you still want to put those handcuffs on me." The three officers exchanged uneasy glances. The tables had turned. But just as Angela thought she had won, a new sound filled the air. The distant wail of more sirens. A half-dozen squad cars sped toward them, lights flashing. Angela's heart pounded. Had she miscalculated? Was this part of their plan? Or was someone else pulling the strings? One thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. The trap tightens. The sirens screamed through the night like a war cry, echoing off the surrounding buildings. Angela stood still, the cold night air suddenly feeling suffocating. The USB drive was still in Nolan's hand. His fingers curled around it tightly as he processed what had just happened. Daniels and Harris were no longer smirking. Their confident arrogance had melted away, replaced with the cold dread of uncertainty. But the flashing lights closing in weren't a victory. They were a warning. Angela knew that if these were their reinforcements, she wouldn't be walking away from this. She had pushed them into a corner. And that made her dangerous. Dangerous people didn't get to walk free. Her body tensed, every muscle prepared for the next move. The first squad car skidded to a halt, doors flying open almost in sync. Angela counted 6 officers stepping out, their hands on their weapons. The tension was electric, and for a moment, no one spoke. They were waiting for someone to give the command. Then, another car pulled up, this one different. Sleek, unmarked. Angela's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a routine backup. This was something bigger. The door of the unmarked car swung open, and a tall man in a dark gray suit stepped out. His polished shoes tapped against the pavement as he approached, his expression unreadable. His presence alone shifted the energy in the lot. Even Daniels and Harris stiffened at the sight of him. Angela didn't recognize him, but she didn't have to. She knew exactly what he was. The man who cleaned up messes. Angela had seen his type before. Too clean. Too smooth. The kind of man who never left fingerprints. He wasn't a cop. At least not in the way Daniels and Harris were. He was something worse. Internal affairs. Government agent. Fixer. It didn't matter. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the scene like a chessboard. "So," the man said at last, his voice calm, controlled. "This is the girl." Daniels cleared his throat, his earlier arrogance returning in a desperate attempt to mask his nerves. Yeah. Angela Thompson. Caught her with stolen property." The man raised a hand, cutting him off without looking at him. His gaze was locked onto Angela, studying her. She met his stare, refusing to show any fear. "You're a prosecutor," the man said simply. Angela didn't respond. He tilted his head slightly, intrigued. A little young for a federal prosecutor. Angela's pulse quickened. He knew exactly who she was. And that meant one thing. This wasn't an accident. He was here for her. Daniel shuffled awkwardly beside her. "We, didn't know that at first, sir, but she planted evidence." Angela cut in, her voice sharp. "Fabricated charges. And now that they know who I am, they're trying to cover their tracks." The man smiled. It wasn't friendly. "You talk like a lawyer," he mused. "But that won't help you tonight." Angela took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Who are you?" He glanced at Nolan, then at the USB drive still in his hand. "I'm the man who makes sure people like you don't become a problem." Angela's skin went cold. She knew what that meant. This wasn't about corruption anymore. This was a cover-up. A big one. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had spent months investigating these officers, documenting their crimes, preparing to take them down. But the moment she exposed herself, something bigger had taken notice. And now they wanted to erase her. "I'm not scared of you," she said. The man's smirk deepened. "That's your first mistake." He turned to Daniels and Harris. "Take her in." Angela didn't have time to think. As soon as she saw Daniels reach for his handcuffs, she moved. Fast. She grabbed the USB drive from Nolan's grip before he could react and ran. Shouts erupted behind her, orders to stop, but she didn't hesitate. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted toward the nearest alleyway, her heart hammering in her chest. They weren't going to arrest her. They were going to disappear her. She heard them behind her, their heavy boots pounding the ground in pursuit. She dodged between parked cars, cut sharply down a side street, leaped over a fence, anything to get away. She needed time, just enough time to get this drive to someone who could use it. But she wasn't fast enough. A black SUV screeched to a stop at the other end of the alley, blocking her path. Before she could turn, a figure stepped out, a different man in a suit. Same clean-cut look, same cold eyes. Another fixer. Angela skidded to a halt, breathing hard. She glanced over her shoulder. Daniels and Harris were closing in. The man from the unmarked car stood farther back, watching, his expression unreadable. Trapped. Her mind raced. Think. She gripped the USB drive tightly in her palm. She could feel the weight of everything inside it. Names, dates, evidence. The proof she had worked so hard to gather. But proof meant nothing if she didn't live long enough to use it. The man in front of her adjusted his tie. "Miss Thompson, let's not make this difficult." Angela's eyes darted between them, searching for an opening. She could fight, but they would overpower her. She could try to run, but they would catch her. She needed a distraction. Slowly, She raised her hands in mock surrender, taking the step forward. "All right," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "You got me." Daniels chuckled behind her. "Smart girl." Angela took another step. Closer, closer. Then, she threw the USB drive. Not to them. Behind them. Hard. It landed in the gutter, right beneath a storm drain. Everyone turned instinctively. Angela moved. She lunged at the man in front of her, catching him off guard. A solid knee to the stomach sent him staggering back. Before Daniels and Harris could react, she grabbed a nearby trash can and shoved it into them. Then she ran. Not for the alley exit. For the sewer grate. Her fingers scraped against the metal as she yanked it up. The smell was overwhelming, but she didn't care. She had one shot. A gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past her, but she didn't stop. Angela dropped into the darkness. The last thing she saw before the grate slammed shut above her was the man in the suit watching her. Not angry, not panicked. Amused. Like he knew this wasn't over. And he was right. Because Angela wasn't running. She was regrouping. And when she came back, she wouldn't be alone. Into the depths, Angela hit the ground hard. The cold, slimy surface of the underground tunnel sent a shock through her body as she landed, barely rolling to absorb the impact. Her lungs burned from the chase, her pulse hammering in her ears. The stench of stagnant water and rusted metal filled the air, but she had no time to dwell on it. Move. Now. Above her, muffled voices echoed through the night. The men who had been chasing her were still there. They hadn't given up. Not yet. She pressed her back against the damp concrete wall, breathing heavily as she listened. She went down there. One of the voices asked, "Daniels." Another voice, calmer, "The man in the suit." "Yes, and she's exactly where we want her." Angela's stomach tightened. What did that mean? "Should we go in after her?" Harris asked. A pause. "No," the suited man replied. "Let her run for now." Angela's fingers clenched into fists. What was their game? If they thought she was trapped, why not come after her? "You think she'll come back up?" Daniels asked, sounding doubtful. The man in the suit chuckled. "Of course she will. She's a prosecutor. She still thinks she can win." Angela bit her lip, forcing herself to stay calm. They weren't chasing her anymore because they didn't have to. They knew something she didn't. And that scared her. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of breaking. They had underestimated her before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. She turned, squinting into the tunnel ahead. The dim light from the street above barely reached down here, but she could see enough. The tunnel stretched in both directions, disappearing into shadows. A maze. Angela had no idea where they led, but she knew one thing. Staying in one place was a death sentence. She took off running. The underground game. Angela moved quickly but carefully, her footsteps splashing through shallow, grimy water. The tunnel walls were covered in old graffiti, the air thick with decay and mildew. She knew cities like this had vast underground systems, sewers, service tunnels, abandoned subway lines. She just hoped she had picked the right one. Every few minutes she paused, listening. No footsteps, no voices. But that didn't mean she was safe. She needed to think, to plan. She had one advantage: the USB drive. Or at least, she hoped she did. Angela slowed, reaching into her pocket and feeling around. Her fingers closed around cold metal, and she let out a shaky breath. It was still there. But what was on it? She had gathered so much evidence over the past months. Recordings, documents, financial records, all pointing to a network of corruption deeper than she had imagined. But now, knowing that the man in the suit was involved, she realized she had barely scratched the surface. Her heart pounded as she considered her next move. Who can I trust? Nolan had helped her before, but she wasn't sure if even he could be trusted now. She had no way of knowing how deep this conspiracy ran. She needed an outside source, someone far enough removed that they couldn't be bought or silenced. Then it hit her. Monroe. Angela's fingers tightened around the USB. Detective Isaac Monroe, a former cop-turned-private investigator, one of the only honest men left. He had worked with her once before, back when she first started her investigation. If anyone could help her now, it was him. But reaching him would be another challenge. She had no phone, no car, no money, just the USB and the clothes on her back. She needed to find a way back to the surface. Angela pressed on, her eyes scanning the tunnel for any signs of an exit. Then, up ahead, she spotted something. A faint glow of light streaming through a metal grate. An opening. She hurried toward it, gripping the rusted ladder bolted to the wall. Climbing quickly, she peered through the bars. The street above was empty. A chance. Angela took a deep breath and pushed against the grate. It didn't budge. Locked. Damn it. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to think. There had to be another way out. Then she noticed something, an old maintenance hatch just a few feet away. She climbed down and moved toward it, her fingers fumbling against the latch. It was rusted, stiff from years of neglect, but she pushed harder. It gave way. Angela slipped inside. A friend in the dark. The maintenance tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for her to move through. Her fingers brushed against cobwebs and rusted pipes as she made her way forward. Then, after what felt like forever, she saw it. A door. Angela pushed it open and found herself inside a basement, a dusty, cluttered space filled with old crates and broken furniture. She wasn't alone. A shadow shifted in the corner. Angela froze. Then, a voice. Didn't expect company tonight. Her pulse spiked. From the shadows stepped a man, grizzled, rough, but familiar. Monroe. Angela's breath hitched. How was this possible? Had she just stumbled into the right place? Monroe eyed her, arms crossed. You look like hell. Angela let out a shaky laugh. It's been a long night. Monroe studied her, then his gaze drifted to her hand. The USB drive still clenched tightly in her fist. His jaw tightened. You brought trouble, didn't you? Angela nodded. The worst kind. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple. All right, kid. Start talking. The deepest betrayal. Angela spilled everything. The planted evidence. The setup. The man in the suit. How they had been watching her for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Monroe listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he exhaled sharply. This is bad. Angela gave him a look. You think? No, Monroe said. I mean worse than you think. He took the USB drive from her hand, turning it over between his fingers. You've been investigating corruption at the precinct level, but what you have here, it's bigger. Angela frowned. How much bigger? Monroe's eyes darkened. National. The words hit her like a freight train. Wait, you're saying? I'm saying, Monroe cut in, that these guys aren't just bad cops. They're connected. This is organized. You expose them. You're not just bringing down a few officers. You're bringing down an empire. Angela's stomach churned. How deep did this go? Monroe slid the USB into his laptop, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. His eyes flickered over the data, his expression shifting from serious to grim. Angela. He turned to her, his voice low. There's something you need to see. Angela leaned in, her pulse quickening as Monroe pulled up a name. A familiar name. A name she never expected. Her own boss. The person who had sent her undercover. The person she had trusted. Angela's breath caught in her throat. Betrayed. The web of lies. Angela's stomach churned as she stared at the screen, her breath shallow and her mind racing. Her boss. The one person she had trusted. The one person who had sent her on this mission in the first place. And now his name was right there, buried deep in the corruption she had been investigating. Monroe's fingers hovered over the laptop keyboard, his face a mask of disbelief. "Angela," he said carefully, as if trying to find the right words, "you need to tell me exactly how much your boss knew about this investigation." Angela's throat tightened. She had trusted her superior, confided in him. The man who had approved her undercover work, the man who had given her access to files that most prosecutors weren't allowed to touch. She swallowed hard. Everything. Monroe let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his forehead. "That's not good." Angela leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. "Tell me what you found." Monroe hesitated, but then he turned the screen toward her. The files on the USB drive contained transaction records, case manipulation logs, and sealed reports, all connecting her boss, U.S. Attorney Frederick Dalton, to multiple high-ranking officials in law enforcement, private security firms, and even local politicians. Angela's hands clenched into fists. He hadn't just known about the corruption. He had been controlling it. She felt sick. Her stomach twisted as she scrolled through the documents. "He was never trying to expose this," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was covering it up." Monroe nodded grimly. "And when you got too close, he let them throw you under the bus." Angela's mind reeled. It all made sense now. The moment she had started getting closer to the truth, the police had moved on her. The man in the suit, the squad cars, the perfectly timed setup, it had all been orchestrated. Dalton had been playing her, and now she was a liability. Her chest tightened as the weight of it all crashed down on her. "I should have seen it," she whispered. Monroe closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "You weren't supposed to see it. That's how guys like him operate. They make you believe you're in control, until you're not." Angela shook her head, trying to push down the frustration bubbling inside her. "So what now?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Do we take this to the FBI? The press?" Monroe frowned. "You don't get it, kid. This isn't just some dirty cop ring. It's a network. Dalton's not just covering up crimes. He's managing them." Angela exhaled sharply. "You think he's the top guy?" Monroe scoffed. "No. He's a middleman. There's someone even higher pulling the strings." Angela's pulse quickened. "Who?" Monroe leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That's what we need to find out." Angela bit the inside of her cheek, trying to suppress the unease crawling up her spine. It was one thing to expose a corrupt police department, but if this was bigger, if it stretched beyond the local level, then she was facing something she might not be able to fight alone. And that terrified her. A race against time. Angela paced the room, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Every instinct told her to go public, to expose everything immediately, but she knew better than that. If this network was as powerful as Monroe suspected, going public without a solid plan would be suicide. She turned to Monroe. "We need to move fast. Dalton knows I escaped. He'll be looking for me." Monroe nodded. "Agreed. But first, we need to back this up." He pulled out another USB drive, quickly copying the files. "We make copies. Multiple. And we don't store them in just one place." Angela crossed her arms. "Where do we send them?" Monroe sighed. "I've got a few people I trust, old friends in places that Dalton hasn't reached yet." He looked up at her. "But that won't be enough." Angela frowned. "Why not?" "Because," Monroe said, sliding the USB into his pocket, "this isn't just about exposing Dalton. We need leverage." Angela exhaled sharply. "You're saying we blackmail him." "I'm saying we play the game," Monroe corrected. "Right now, they think they have all the power. We need to make them believe that if they take you out, they go down too." Angela hated it. Every part of her screamed that they should take this to the authorities. But who could she trust? Dalton had placed people everywhere. If she wasn't careful, she'd end up disappeared before she could even get to the truth. She nodded reluctantly. "Fine. What's the plan? Monroe pulled out his phone, quickly typing something. We set a trap. Angela arched an eyebrow. A trap. Monroe smirked. Dalton wants you dead, right? Let's make him come to us. Angela's breath caught in her throat. It was insane. But it was also the only way. Baiting the monster. Monroe's plan was simple. Leak just enough information to make Dalton nervous. Not enough to expose the entire operation, but enough to make him feel like he was losing control. Angela would be the bait. The goal? Get Dalton to meet in person. It was risky, extremely risky. But Angela knew it was the only way to get answers, and possibly even the name of the person above him. Monroe sent out an encrypted message through an old contact, a fabricated leak, suggesting that Angela had already handed the files over to someone powerful. It was a lie, but it was a lie that Dalton wouldn't be able to ignore. Angela sat on the edge of the desk, arms crossed. What if he doesn't bite? Monroe shrugged. Then we moved to Plan B. Angela raised an eyebrow. And Plan B is? Monroe smirked. We burn his entire operation to the ground. Angela couldn't help but smile. Now that was a plan she could get behind. The call that changed everything. They didn't have to wait long. Monroe's burner phone buzzed barely an hour later. Angela and Monroe exchanged a glance. Monroe picked up, keeping his voice casual. Yeah. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. You've been busy, Monroe. Angela's stomach clenched. It was him. Frederick Dalton. Monroe smirked. Guess you finally figured out you've got a problem. A pause. Then Dalton chuckled. You're not as smart as you think you are. Angela leaned closer, listening. Dalton continued. You want a meeting? Fine. Let's talk. Monroe raised an eyebrow. That easy? Dalton's voice darkened. You think this is a negotiation? Angela felt a chill go down her spine. Dalton wasn't afraid. That meant he had a plan too. We'll see you soon, Dalton said. The call ended. Angela and Monroe stared at each other. This is bad, Angela said. Monroe nodded. Yeah, but it's also our only shot. Angela took a deep breath. Time to face the devil. The meeting with the devil. Angela sat in the dimly lit room, her hands resting on the cold wooden table in front of her. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. She could hear the faint hum of traffic outside. But in this moment, the world beyond these walls didn't exist. Across from her, Monroe leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp, calculating. The tension between them was unspoken but understood. This is a suicide mission, he finally said. Angela exhaled slowly. Then why are you still here? Monroe smirked, shaking his head. Because I don't like losing. And neither do you. Angela met his gaze. He was right. She had come too far, risked too much. She wasn't going to let Dalton win. Monroe tapped his fingers against the table. Dalton's got resources, power, people. He wouldn't agree to a meeting unless he thought he had the upper hand. Angela nodded. That's why we have to make him think he doesn't. Monroe's smirk faded. You realize what you're doing, right? You're not just exposing a dirty prosecutor. You're pulling at the threads of an entire system. The people behind Dalton, they don't play fair. Angela leaned forward. Neither do I. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple. All right, kid. Let's do this. The setup. They chose a neutral location for the meeting, an abandoned train station on the outskirts of the city. It was secluded, surrounded by empty lots and rusting tracks. The perfect place for a conversation that was never meant to happen. Angela arrived first, dressed simply in dark jeans and a hoodie, her hair pulled back tight. No weapons, no backup, just the USB drive in her pocket and every ounce of courage she had left. Monroe was nearby, watching from a distance. He had insisted on being close in case things went sideways. Angela hadn't argued. She stood on the cracked concrete, hands in her pockets, waiting. Then they arrived. A black SUV pulled up near the station entrance, its tinted windows revealing nothing. Angela tensed, her heart pounding as the back door opened. Frederick Dalton stepped out. Even in the dim light, he looked every bit the powerful man he was. Sharp suit, polished shoes, the air of someone who had spent his entire life above consequences. And yet, there was something different this time. A slight stiffness in his posture, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Angela smirked. He was nervous. Good. Dalton adjusted his cuffs, surveying the area. I expected you to run, he said casually. Angela tilted her head. I expected you to be smarter. Dalton chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Bold, but boldness only gets you so far. He took a slow step forward. Angela didn't move. You should have taken the fall, Angela, he continued. Would have been easier for everyone. Angela's jaw tightened. Easier for you, you mean? Dalton sighed, almost disappointed. You don't understand what you're dealing with. You think this is about a few bad cops. A corrupt prosecutor. He shook his head. You have no idea how deep this goes. Angela stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then why are you here? Dalton smirked. Because you made yourself a problem. And problems need to be handled. Angela's fingers brushed against the USB in her pocket. You sure you want to do this? Dalton's smirk didn't falter. You don't have anything, Angela. Whatever you think you found, it won't be enough. Angela pulled the USB from her pocket, twirling it between her fingers. You sure about that? Dalton's eyes flickered to the small device, just for a second, before he recovered. But Angela saw it. The doubt. The fear. He knew. Angela stepped closer. You should have been more careful, Dalton. I have everything. Your transactions, your communications, the people above you. Dalton's expression darkened. You're bluffing. Angela smiled. Am I? Dalton exhaled, composing himself. Even if you do have something, where would you take it? The FBI. He scoffed. You really think they're clean? Angela knew he was right. This wasn't just a citywide problem. It was bigger. Global, maybe. But that didn't mean she was out of options. I don't need the FBI, she said. I just need the truth to be public. Dalton laughed at that. Public. He shook his head. And who's going to believe you? A 19-year-old girl claiming she uncovered a national conspiracy. Angela clenched her jaw. They'll believe me when the evidence is live-streamed to millions of people. Dalton froze. Angela's smirk widened. That's right. This conversation, it's already being recorded. Dalton's face paled slightly. You wouldn't. Angela shrugged. Guess you'll find out. Dalton's entire demeanor shifted. The arrogance cracked. You're making a mistake, Angela. Angela leaned in slightly. So did you. Dalton exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He was calculating now, trying to find a way out. Angela's heart pounded in her chest. She had him on the ropes, but this wasn't over yet. Then, his gaze flicked to something behind her. Angela's stomach dropped. A setup. Before she could react, she heard footsteps. Heavy. Fast. Her body moved on instinct. She ducked just as a gunshot rang through the station. Monroe. Angela spun, her adrenaline surging. Monroe had been watching from a distance, but now he was running toward her, gun drawn. Dalton's men had moved in from the shadows. 4 of them, armed. Angela's heart pounded. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a hit. Angela, move, Monroe shouted. She ran. Bullets ricocheted off the rusted metal beams as she sprinted for cover, Monroe laying down suppressive fire. The station was a maze of abandoned tracks and rusting freight cars. Dalton had disappeared. Angela pressed herself against a concrete pillar, breathing hard. Monroe slid next to her, his face tense. This just went to hell, he muttered. Angela clenched her fists. We're still alive. That means we still have a chance. Monroe glanced at her. You really think we can win this? Angela didn't hesitate. Yes. Monroe exhaled, shaking his head. Damn, you're crazier than I thought. Angela peered around the corner, spotting one of Dalton's men creeping closer. She grabbed a loose metal pipe from the ground. Monroe raised an eyebrow. Seriously? Angela smirked. Watch and learn. The moment the man stepped forward, Angela swung. The pipe connected hard with his arm, sending his gun flying. She followed up with a sharp elbow to his jaw, dropping him instantly. Monroe whistled. Remind me never to piss you off. Angela didn't have time to respond. More men were coming. They needed to move. Fast. She grabbed the fallen man's gun, checking the clip. Half full. It would have to do. Monroe glanced at her. So, what's the plan, kid? Angela took a deep breath, her mind racing. Dalton was gone. But this wasn't over. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, every victim of this corruption. She had the evidence. Now she just needed to survive long enough to use it. Angela turned to Monroe, her eyes blazing with determination. We bring them down. Monroe grinned. Now that's a plan. Angela cocked the stolen gun. Time to finish this. The final gambit. The night sky stretched above Angela like an unspoken threat, the moon barely visible behind layers of thick, swirling clouds. The train station was eerily silent now, except for the occasional distant siren, reminding her that the world outside was still moving. But her world? Her world was on fire. Angela crouched behind a rusted metal container, gripping the stolen gun tightly in her trembling fingers. This was it. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed. It all came down to this moment. Dalton was gone. His men were hunting her, and she had the evidence that could bring them all down. But none of that would matter if she didn't make it out of here alive. Monroe crouched beside her, reloading his weapon with a sharp click. He was breathing hard, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. All right, kid, he muttered. What's the move? Angela's mind was racing. Dalton had underestimated her before, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. He would be retreating now, covering his tracks, but that didn't mean she couldn't beat him at his own game. She had one advantage. The live stream, she whispered. Monroe frowned. You think he believes you? Angela smirked. Oh, he believes me. That's why he ran. Monroe exhaled sharply. So what? We put the files online and hope for the best. Angela shook her head. No. We make it public. We expose him in real time. Monroe's eyes widened. You're crazy. Angela nodded. And it's gonna work. A broadcast to the world. They had no time, no safe house, no backup. But they had the truth. Angela pulled out her phone, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. The USB drive was still clenched tightly in her palm. I need to get this uploaded now. Monroe peered around the corner, gun ready. We don't have long before they find us. Angela took a deep breath and opened her encrypted backup system. The files began uploading automatically, bouncing between multiple secure locations, set to release publicly in exactly 10 minutes. If anything happened to her, the truth would still come out. She clicked the final button, launching a live stream to every major social media platform. The screen flickered for a moment before showing her face, sweaty and streaked with dirt, her eyes blazing with determination. This is Angela Thompson, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. If you're seeing this, then I need you to listen carefully. She glanced at Monroe, who gave her a slight nod before turning back to guard their position. I am a federal prosecutor. I was sent undercover to investigate corruption within the police department. What I found is much worse than I ever imagined. She turned the camera to show the train station around her. Right now, I am being hunted by a network of corrupt law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and government officials. They planted evidence on me. They tried to frame me. And now, They want me dead. Angela inhaled sharply. This was the moment. I have the evidence, she said, holding up the USB. And I'm uploading it now. Every document, every secret conversation, every crime they've committed. You will see everything. She leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a whisper. And if anything happens to me, you'll know exactly who is responsible. The screen blinked as her location pinged live for her viewers to see. Angela ended the stream. She turned to Monroe. We need to move. Monroe grinned. That'll piss them off. Angela smiled. Good. The escape. Angela and Monroe sprinted across the station, moving through the abandoned tracks like ghosts. Then, gunfire. Bullets whizzed past them, hitting metal and concrete with deafening echoes. They found us, Monroe shouted. Angela ducked behind a metal beam, her heart racing. She could see at least 5 men closing in from the far end of the station. Dalton's men, his enforcers. Monroe peeked out and fired 2 quick shots, forcing them to retreat behind cover. Angela knew they couldn't stay here. They had to escape. She scanned the area, her mind working overtime. Then she saw it. A train. It was old, rusted, but still on the tracks. And most importantly, it was facing an open exit to the main road. Angela turned to Monroe. We take the train. Monroe raised an eyebrow. You know how to drive a train. Angela smirked. No, but I know how to make one move. They ran for it. Gunfire exploded behind them as Dalton's men realized what they were doing. Angela climbed onto the train, Monroe right behind her. She reached the control panel, flipping every switch she could find. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Monroe grabbed a metal lever. This better work, Hid. Angela pulled the throttle. The train lurched forward. A desperate chase. The train moved slowly at first, creeping forward on the rusted tracks. Then, as it picked up speed, Angela saw something that sent her heart plummeting. Dalton's men had anticipated this. A black SUV sped toward them, matching the train's pace on the parallel road. Angela's stomach clenched. Dalton was in the SUV. The passenger window rolled down, and a rifle appeared. Down, Monroe shouted. The first shot shattered a window above Angela's head. Angela dove for cover, her fingers gripping the USB drive so tightly it felt like it might crack. Monroe fired back, but they were outmatched. The SUV was faster, their firepower stronger. Angela's mind raced. Then, an idea. She scrambled to the control panel, searching for a manual override. Her eyes locked onto a switch labeled EMERG and SUI speed or ELES. Angela flipped it. The train jerked violently, its old wheels screaming as it surged forward. The SUV tried to keep up, but the train was gaining speed now, the tracks curving sharply ahead. Angela turned just in time to see the SUV swerve. It clipped a guardrail, flipped once, twice, and slammed into a metal barrier. The crash was brutal. Angela's breath came in ragged gasps as she watched the wreckage. Dalton's men were down. But was Dalton? She couldn't see. Monroe grabbed her shoulder. We need to go. Angela swallowed, nodding. The train was approaching an intersection where they could jump off and disappear into the city. As they reached the opening, Monroe jumped first, rolling onto the gravel. Angela hesitated for half a second, then jumped. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she scrambled to her feet. They ran. Behind them, the train kept moving, disappearing into the distance. Angela didn't look back. The endgame. An hour later, Angela and Monroe sat in a darkened safe house, staring at the news alerts blowing up their phones. QORUPTYO and exposed. Federal PROSECUTO. UNVILS POLICES QONASPIRACY. Angela exhaled, letting the exhaustion crash into her. They had done it. Monroe chuckled, shaking his head. "You're insane, kid." Angela smirked. And yet, it worked. Monroe raised an eyebrow. "So, what now?" Angela leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Dalton was still out there. But now, so was the truth. Angela wasn't running anymore. She was hunting. And Dalton? He was next.